Sat Shri Akal. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to our session, Pain and Pride, Punjab's Journey Through the Years. I'm Rasikpriya Sandhu, and joining me are Amandeep and Sarpreet Singh. Before we start, I'll just take a minute to talk about Amandeep and Sarpreet Singh's books, respectively. Last year, Amandeep published the book, Punjab, Journey Through the Fault Lines. It's a wonderfully researched, vast, and exhaustive piece of work. It covers a multitude of topics and has been shortlisted for a lot of awards. Mr. Singh's debut novel, The Camel Merchant of Philadelphia, focused upon the role of foreigners in Maharaja Ranjit Singh's court, and he's recently published Night of the Restless Spirits, for which I would like to congratulate you.
Thank you.
This is a beautifully written book, which is in the form of short stories evolving around the horror of 1984, focusing upon ordinary people who were caught up in the chain of these catastrophic events. It's a dedication to all the nameless victims and the unsung heroes of 84. So I would like to welcome both of you and dive into the session right now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My first question goes out to Amandeep. Amandeep, in the title to your book, you use this very scientific term, fault lines. So what are these fault lines that you refer to when you talk about Punjab?
That is a longer answer question, and but here is a challenge to everybody who's listening. Give me a Punjabi term for fault lines. Unless I have the term, I can't publish the book in Punjabi. The translation is ongoing. So please suggest names. The book is a mix of Punjab, the way I saw it between 2015 and 17. And it has contextual history in it and also memoirs, because I thought only a mix of these three could actually make a book which would hold good as a book. There are 16 chapters, and the fault lines which I feel are not really the ones which have been talked about in political circles and economic circles most of the time. They are really the apathy of the state, both center and the state, towards the issues of the people. The anger among people over many injustices, past and present, ongoing. The issue of loans, which is really burdening Punjab. The issue of waters that is burdening Punjab. The issue of caste, which has plagued the Sikh society. The issue of being thrown out of the religion. The Sahajdari, Keshdari controversy. The issue of drugs. The issue of Punjab being a border state. These are the various education, health. These are the various points on which Punjab, God forbid, but Punjab can crack. And fault lines are actually the cracks on the face of a rock which lead to earthquakes. So it's my hope that this kind of a book brings us awareness about what is going on, and we manage to curtail the fault lines.
Okay, thank you for that, Amandeep. I also couldn't help but notice that all the three of us, we haven't really lived in Punjab in the last few years. So it made me wonder if that is the reason why we all gravitated towards our own roots, as if you're trying to fill some sort of void. So, Mr. Singh, I want to ask this particularly to you, especially being a part of the diaspora. Do you agree with that?
Yes, very much so. And I think my own personal journey mirrors that very significantly. I've actually never lived in Punjab. I was raised in Sikkim, where I was until I completed high school. And then I went to college in Rajasthan at Pilani, worked in Mumbai for a couple of years, and then moved to the US. So ironically, when I left India, I was the product of a typical, middle class, upper middle class Indian education, educated in so-called public schools. Really, I had no connection to my language, my culture, my faith. It was quite tenuous. And, my story is not unique. I think exiles driven by something or the other always tend to gravitate to their roots. And it was no different for me. So in a certain sense, I started discovering my roots in the diaspora. So your comment is very much spot on.
Right. Mr. Singh, we're going to mainly focus on your book since it's the newer book. I want to know what was it that made you write this book after 36 years? The events of 84 and 2020, 36 years have elapsed in between. What was that turning point for you?
Sure, I'll be delighted to address that. But first, I want to thank Amandeep for his graciousness and suggesting that we focus on my book because it's newer. Before I launch into that, I have a personal story to tell about a debt. One of the reasons why I'm a published author today is Amandeep. And I'm going to embarrass him by telling him the story. Several years ago, we were Facebook friends. We had never really connected. And I just reached out to him casually and I said, well, I have this collection of short pieces. They are book length. I'm looking for a publisher. Any ideas? Well, let me tell you this. My experience is that in a lot of contexts, people who are successful are never willing to help anybody else. And Amandeep was clearly an exception. The short version is that he connected me to one of his personal friends who's an editor at Westland, Karthik Venkatesh. And that was kind of the genesis of the Camel Merchant of Philadelphia. So I just wanted to acknowledge that debt at the outset. And I'm really delighted to be part of this panel with Amandeep and you. So I left India in 87, roughly 3 years after the events of 1984, because of my lack of a connection to anything Punjabi or Sikh, and because of the fact that I was at Pilani, sort of far removed from everything when the events of 1984 were actually occurring, I really didn't have a very strong personal connection to them. Even more so, the narrative in the Indian press at that time was very carefully controlled. Perhaps, in a lot of contexts, it might be called propaganda more than anything else. And let me explain what I mean by that. The narrative about November 1984 roughly went as follows. The Sikh bodyguards of the beloved Prime Minister assassinated her in retaliation for an attack on the Sri Harmandir Sahib several months ago, which was very necessary to rid the country of extremism and terrorism. And in retaliation, there was an outpouring of anger during which some Sikhs were targeted in Delhi and in other places. Did I believe that narrative? Absolutely. Lock, stock, and barrel. And why? Because we're talking about a time when the internet didn't exist and we really didn't have any alternate sources of information. So the other thing was that while nobody in India at that time said that what had happened to the Sikhs in 1984 was good or even okay, a lot of people deep in their hearts felt that the Sikhs kind of asked for it. How can I say that with such confidence? Well, as a young Sikh man who had never lived in Punjab, that's how I felt. So that was my engagement with 1984. My epiphany came a few years later when I was in the US. Now, in the aftermath of 1984, of course, I knew that something had happened in Delhi. I had spoken to some cousins, who had to take shelter, and some of them had given up their turbans and their Sikh identity as a result of the violence of November 1984. And I had heard talk of this so-called Black Book, which had been written by human rights activists in Delhi, which told a starkly different tale of what had actually happened. I couldn't get my hands on it because it was not in circulation. I believe it had been banned. This was a booklet called Who Are the Guilty, which had been published by the PUCL and the PUDR, which are reputed civil rights organizations. Long story short, a few years later, as I was, quote, searching for my roots, I started engaging with 1984, and I started finding in my university library newspaper articles from the international press that painted a very different picture of what had happened. Being a skeptical young man, I really didn't believe them. I figured it might be quote unquote Western propaganda. That's when I stumbled upon two reports. One, the Black Book, Who Are the Guilty? The second one was Oppression in Punjab, produced under the aegis of Justice Tarkunde, retired from the Bombay High Court, that talked about Operation Blue Star and what actually transpired in Amritsar several months earlier. Both of these books were absolutely shocking, and they completely upended my view of what had happened. Now, these books were not from Sikh sources. They were from reputable human rights organizations. To me, they seemed fairly credible. And then I stumbled upon an article written by Madhu Kishwar called Gangster Rule, which had been published in her magazine Manushi. In sharp contrast to a lot of her colleagues in media, Ms. Kishwar had fearlessly written what had actually transpired in Delhi during those dark days in November. And her article corroborated the Who Are the Guilty booklet 100%. So now I had a couple of unimpeachable sources that told me that what had happened was very, very different. And it created a lot of turmoil in my heart. We're talking about, the 87, 88 timeframe. I'm a young man. I've just moved to the US. I stumbled upon an academic paper written by Delhi anthropologist Dr. Veena Das, who subsequently left India and taught at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Das had studied the families of Sikhs who had survived violence from the poorest neighborhoods in Delhi. They had been resettled in Tilak Vihar, which is in popular parlance known as the quote unquote widow colony. That's where a lot of the Sikh widows of Delhi 1984 were resettled. So Dr. Das presented a poignant account of several of the children who had survived and talked about their PTSD. One of the stories struck me in particular. It was the story of a young boy called Avatar who was deaf and mute. And unable to articulate his pain in any other manner, this child would use his hands and his body to mime out what had happened to his father. His father was lynched before the boy's eyes and hung from a tree until he died. So the turmoil that all of these things created in my heart, when I started learning about what had happened, poured out in the form of a story in verse, which is the 8th story in this collection called Kultar's Mime. So I fictionalized it, and Avatar became Kultar. I added the stories of other children and some of the factual things that I had learned about 1984, and that was the genesis of Kultar's Mime. This was written, I would say, about 30 years ago, roughly. And a couple of the other stories in the collection, most notably the title story, Night of the Restless Spirits, was written around that time as well. Many years passed, I got busy raising a family with a career. My background is business and technology. And to give you the short version, about 6 years ago, my daughter, who was then a freshman student studying theater, decided to turn Kultar's Mime into a play. Much against my sage advice, I suggested to her that it would never work. Well, when we were done, we had presented the play 90 times in 6 countries, including twice in Delhi. And I was witness to an outpouring of compassion from people all around the world, and really tremendous catharsis from the Sikh community. That was really my inflection point. I dedicated myself to writing from then on, and wrote several other stories which now appear in this collection. The purpose of the collection was really to examine 1984 in all of its nuance. Of course, bad things happen to Sikhs, quote unquote, is an important part of the book because bad things did indeed happen. But the story of 1984 is not just the story of Sikhs who suffered, it's also the story of their non Sikh friends and neighbors who often put themselves and their families at risk to save Sikh lives. It's the story of fearless government servants who put their careers at risk to save Sikh lives. So the attempt in this collection was to examine something as complex as 1984 in all of its nuance and from many, many different angles. I apologize for that long-winded answer, but I just wanted to give you the complete context of how this came about.
That's a very interesting story indeed. I want to ask both of you about your research process because Mr. Singh in particular, you going back about 36 years back into history. Aman, did you have a plan when you were researching your book? Did everything go according to that plan, or did you find things changing as you started along?
Well, my plan was very simple. I had drawn up a proposal and I just said I will roam around and there will be the book. But when I landed in Punjab, the farmer agitation over the white fly was going on. And just on the back of that, the sacrilege incidents happened. This was October 2015. And suddenly Punjab erupted in silent anger. There were hardly any violent incidents, but we remember in Punjab for weeks, we all got out, Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, everybody, Christians, and we just protested saying Rosh. The administration disappeared. The ministers never came out. SGPC was stoned, when their officials tried to come because there was something murky in all those dealings. And it was deja vu for me to the time in 2007 when my mother was uh, dying in Mandi Dabwali from cancer, and I could not come to Chandigarh to pick up morphine for her because that Baba Ram Rahim, he had annoyed the Sikhs with his Guru get up and all that. And Punjab was burning. And I look back at 84, and this is exactly what happens every time, that there is always a genuine people's protest, and then it is sidelined through a state-engineered religious intervention. 84, in my opinion, is about, the two aspects are known, that there was a law and order issue and the government had been suspended, but it was also about farmers' agitation, which was huge in March 1984. And in fact, even General Barar in his book says that we were scared that Punjab would stop sending wheat into the rest of the country. And so I said, what will you do? So you'll bomb Punjab to get wheat out of it? Punjab is not a food producing colony of India, but that is how Punjabis feel. When all this happened, I really realized that my plans can go for a toss. I need to dedicate myself to actually traveling and learning and living with people and understanding. There were two things which I would just like to flag here, which I decided to do. One was to not shoot the messenger. Punjab is a lined mine of narratives. And I allowed myself to listen to all sorts of narratives depending upon the political position of a person. And the second thing I decided was not to go to the experts of Punjab. मैं किसे बोर्ड दे दरख्त दे थल्ले बैठ के पंजाब नहीं देखना चाहता था. I wanted to see Punjab in its grime, in its dirt, in its stench, and through its seasons, and through my immediate experience on the ground. Third thing I really decided was to not make Punjab a pornography of pain. That is the kind of writing which the American publishing industry really valorizes. Punjab has so much pain. I believe that my readers will understand if I say farmers have committed suicide, if I say boys have disappeared during and after the militancy year, if I say that these issues have happened, there are mothers waiting for sons, fathers waiting for daughters, people would understand it. I don't have to portray all the barbaric reality of Punjab.
Right. So Punjab is a labyrinth indeed. Mr. Singh, I want to ask you now, especially when you talk about Operation Woodrose, the army revolt, especially the incident in your book, the Ramgarh incident. What kind of research and testimonies did you rely upon?
So those are two separate stories. The Night of the Restless Spirits, the title story in the collection, is set at the Gurdwara Dukh Nivaran Sahib. I'll talk to both separately. Interestingly, right around 1984, I had actually heard of the massacre at Dukh Nivaran Sahib. My father, we were in Sikkim. My father used to do a lot of construction work for the military, and as a result, he had several senior army officers were his friends, and one of my uncles was a brigadier in army intelligence. So, in contrast to what was being published in the newspapers, he got pieces of information that I refused to believe. One of them was that there was a massacre at Gurdwara Dukh Nivaran Sahib, and I remember, my younger self scoffing at that time, saying, "You're just being brainwashed by Sikh militant propaganda. I mean, there was no Jarnail Singh Pindranwale at Dukh Nivaran Sahib. Why would Dukh Nivaran Sahib be attacked?" Well, today we know that Operation Woodrose was mounted and 40 plus other gurdwaras were attacked at the same time. Also, my aunt had relocated from the US back to Punjab, and one of their friends was actually an eyewitness to the massacre. So I had a couple of data points, but I refused to believe them. And then subsequently, I learned that this had actually happened. So the Night of the Restless Spirits really came out of that little germ which had sat in my head for years and years. And, as I was researching my roots, I also engaged with the earlier history of the Punjab. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre made a deep impression on me. I had been reading a lot of magic realism at that time, and in particular, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude really, really spoke to me. And I felt that the effacing of massacres and violence perpetrated by the powerful from collective memory is as big a tragedy as the violence itself. So that was really the genesis of the story that is set in Dukh Nivaran Sahib, which really connects the Jallianwala Bagh massacre and Operation Woodrose, and then kind of expands the canvas to thread together the pain of Punjab over millennia, our unique geographic position as the gateway to the Indian subcontinent has resulted in great benefits, but also great pain over millennia. And this is a small story, but it has a large canvas and it tries to thread all that together. The military revolt in Ramgarh, I was also aware of at that time. You might remember that, well, you wouldn't remember, but the older people in the audience might remember that there was some mention of it in Indian press, and then it kind of sank like a stone. The ostensible reason perhaps was that the Indian Army was and continues to be a highly respected institution. And the notion that there was a large mutiny in the Indian Army, which ended in a firefight, was not something that people really wanted to talk about. Now, this had also stayed in my head. The court-martial is one of the newer stories, and when I was writing it, I went out to research, and I found almost nothing. There's really been very little written about it that I could get my hands on. And then, the miracle of the age of the internet, I actually stumbled upon court-martial trial records of some actual NCOs and soldiers who were brought to book for the mutiny. And that's where some of the color in that story comes from. Of course, it's fiction. The backdrop is nonfiction, but the details are all, made up, quote unquote. So that's where, both of these stories came from.
Mr. Singh, there's also this chapter, I believe it's the second one, The General.
Yes.
I want to know, in your entire writing, is that an entirely fictionalized chapter, or is there any iota of truth to that?
So it's definitely fiction, But a lot of the things that I observed there, the sentiments of young Sikhs in the diaspora. Now, remember, I wasn't in the US in 84. I arrived here in 87, 3 years after the fact. But I have talked to multiple people who were there at that time. And I would say that even in 87, when I was a young graduate student in upstate New York, I attended, informal events at people's homes, particularly religious events. I could still feel the tremendous anger that Sikhs in the diaspora still experience. The events of 1984 were fairly fresh. They were just 3 years old at that time. So how a young Sikh who has abandoned his identity re-embraces it, driven by the pain of 1984. And I won't offer any spoilers here, is fiction, but it's very much sort of, the sentiments are very, very real. And I had the opportunity to observe some of these firsthand. The other thing that's very real is now we know from multiple sources that the so-called movement for an independent nation, Sikh nation in the West, had been very severely co-opted by agents of the Indian government that had a strong vested interest in propaganda victories. And I would urge people to do their own research. So some of the dirty tricks that you encounter in the book are a fictionalized version of things that I found in my research.
Right. So the chapter that stood out the most for me was Kultar's Mime. And I would really like it if you can read out something for the people joining us so that they can connect to what your book is all about.
Sure. I will read a very brief excerpt from Kultar's Mime. This is the story of a young girl, and as I said earlier, the story is told in verse. Yells and chants are heard afar, mingled with painful, agonized screams, as the pogrom continues in Tilak Vihar, brutality beyond our wildest dreams. Breath and gasps, eyes reflect her fears. Down her cheeks stream desperate tears. 4 times already the mob has come, can't shut out its early sinister hum. 4 times her father and brothers too rushed brandishing their shining swords. 4 times repulsed the angry hordes, but then more came and the mob grew. To hope for mercy they cannot dare. Their eyes are shut in silent prayer. Even louder now is the terrible hum. Once again they pick up their swords. An urgent beat sounds on death's drum. The river of reason the mob now fords, launches its final murderous attack. Each man to the wall now has his back. Try to protect the ones they love. What courage, what valor. But God above, even he looks away or has shut his eyes. There are just too many, they do prevail. To pieces is hacked each and every male. The women mute, shocked, cower like mice. Their peril so urgent, acute, and so real. Of satanic laughter they can hear a peal. She's never been so afraid in her life. She's too young and innocent to comprehend. As they come to her, waving stick and knife, she thinks they'll kill her. This is the end. All she can see is a huge circle of hands, fingers that flex, squirm in lecherous glee. Big hands, small hands, dark hands, pale hands, on all of them spots of blood she can see. The lascivious hands and their lewd dance. Realization comes to her in a single glance. She begins to tremble and frightfully shake as a firm hold on her body the hands take. This is from Kultar's Mime.
That's a very beautiful and moving piece. Aman, I want to ask you, what is your take on 84? Is it anyhow different from Mr. Singh's?
No, not really different. I mean, I think it's a collective trauma of a whole people. Paji was a little older. I heard his other talk. He was at Pilani. At that time, I was much younger, and I remember I was growing up in Rourkela, Odisha, uh, and I remember everybody addressing my father as G, Sardar G. And I would always ask him, why do they call you G? Why do they call Mishra Uncle G? Why do they call Matthew Uncle G? Why do they call you Sardar Ji? And he used to say that the people consider the Sikhs to be the farmers and the soldiers of the country, and it is a respect from them. At 11 o'clock on 31st October 1984, my father lost his G, because that is when he was in the market and he was charged upon by people. Friend came home, Matthew uncle came home, took away his papers. He said, these are very important. Another uncle sent a jeep home, a police uncle, and my father and mother were taken to the Gurdwara. There was a as Sarpreet Paji was saying, many civil servants actually rose up to the occasion. At that time, the ADM Raurkela was Mr. Behra. I met him later when I did Roll of Honor. He's the man who saved my parents. While that is true, and we are all engaging in the trauma, and we write about the trauma and all that, but my understanding of 84, everything that everybody writes, with all respect to it, we also need to start theorizing 84 in some things. And the way I see it is this, that modern nations are based on the idea of Rousseau's social contract, which is what led to the French Revolution and the birth of the modern democracy. The social contract is when the government and the citizens engage in a contract with each other, saying that, okay, the government will not infringe on the people's rights, people's religious rights, people's other kinds of freedoms. And the people say yes, and we are happy to pay taxes to this government, give the charge of our security to this government. And that is how a social contract is built between citizens and the state. To me personally, 84 is my watershed moment, because I was 11 years old, and it was everything changed for me. But I think for the community, it was a rupture of the social contract between the Sikh community and the Indian nation state. It will take a lot of time, like it took Paji also to acknowledge it. It took me also a lot of time to really understand it. Now, two parallel things are happening here. One is we are coming to terms with this rupture of the social contract. And at the same time, while we are seeking justice, and justice is the only thing that can heal this rupture, 84 itself has been templatized by communal forces in the country. 84 was repeated in 92, 84 was repeated in 2002, 84 has been repeated multiple times, including just this February in Northeast Delhi. So we have to look at 84 as an emblematic, and we must not forget that there was Nelly massacre in 1983, just before 84. So this was the time when these violences became templatized in the hands of communal forces, and then you buy out the media, you suppress the courts from doing what they're doing, you curtail human rights activists behind bars, and you just launch police operations in which thousands disappear, human rights violations happen, and it just works. It continues to work. And this will remain an eternal struggle. In my humble opinion, I think we must, as Punjab, start looking at healing in many, many ways, and that is to admit that we are, somebody said here as well, and I also argue in my book, for the last 175 years, ever since the British took over 1849, the Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Raj, and then we had partition, and then we had 84, and our traumas are deep, and it is of the whole land of Punjab, which now has been shrunk into these 2.5 rivers. And so it's not really Punjab, this little Punjab.
So I just wanted to add a little bit to that. I really want to thank Amandeep for the observations that he just made. To me, 1984 is not a Sikh story at all. It's a human story. And in order to sort of narrow the focus a little, it is very much an Indian story. And it's important that when we talk about 1984, we absolutely recognize the weaponizing of sectarianism, which Amandeep described so eloquently. This is exactly why we need to focus on all the 84s, because focusing on them, talking about them unabashedly, is perhaps our best insurance against repeating them, particularly in a time when India has been completely seduced by a new muscular strain of chauvinism. I think I have a theory that the pandemic actually shifted attention from what was going on in the early part of the year. Like Amandeep just said, I was in India at that time earlier this year, and I could see a 1984 in the making before my eyes during the Shaheen Bagh agitation and when the students were attacked so brutally in Delhi. So that ultimately, I feel, is the role of art and literature. There are generations of Indians who have never read about 1984, and they never will. Think about it. Who has the incentive to write a chapter about 1984 in India's history books? Nobody. So that's where we writers, quote unquote, have to do our part of the job, so to speak. And, going back to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and his description of the Banana Company perpetrated massacre, this is what we need to focus on, so that as a society, we are sensitized to what happens when things break down, when the social contract, as Amandeep very eloquently described, breaks down. That is really my motivation. It's not so much to say bad things happen to us. We know that. The Sikhs know that bad things happen to them. But I think if anybody understands even an iota of the Sikh ethos, which comes directly from Guru Nanak, the whole point is not to care about your own pain, but the whole point is to care about everyone's pain. And that's what this work really tries to do.
It was very interesting to get both of your points of view on this. I'm born in the aftermath of 84. I'm actually born in 1988. So I think 84 is something that was sort of our inheritance. And as you said, 84 is not something that I read about in any history book. It was mostly in the form of oral tradition or old news weeks that I found lying at home. So both your works, they're really tremendous that they carry out a message to the young millennials in particular. So before we shut down, I would ask Amandeep, do you think Punjab has healed? Are these fault lines that you talk about, are they gone? And if not, what do you think needs to be done to heal Punjab?
That's a very long discussion. I don't have the answers, but you just see what is happening right now, right? The farm bills which came out. Now, Punjab has been tasked with a certain role in the nation's economy. It's been fulfilling it for the last 60 years. It is the granary of the country, Haryana, of course, West UP also. But now, suddenly, you are dismantling the mandi system. You are dismantling the entire structure through which Punjab's agrarian output will be regulated. And there have been protests going on now for 45 days. Trains are still stopped in Punjab, though farmers are not stopping them. The government is not allowed to stop them. When our abrogation of 370 happened, it was only Punjab that stood up with Kashmir, because Punjabis knew that this will happen with us also. And actually, it has started happening with us. How we deal with it, how we come together with it, these are longer discussion. We can't take it up right now. But there is indeed a conflict. Jang Hind Punjab the Hone Laga. That continues. That's been continuing for ages in Punjab.
Right. So with that, I would like to thank both of you, Amandeep and Mr. Singh, for joining us. Having read both your respective books, I would really recommend them to everybody out there who's not read them. Please go get your copies. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. And thank you for doing such a brilliant job moderating the session.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Good night.
Goodbye.